On May 2nd, 1945, newspapers around the world announced one of the most anticipated news. Berlin had surrendered to Soviet forces. It was a clear sign that the Axis powers were crumbling, only a matter of time before collapsing under their own weight. As days passed, the German armed forces also surrendered unconditionally in the West on May 7th and in the East on May 9th. Finally, the 8th day of that same month was proclaimed as Victory in Europe Day. The end of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich had arrived. That's the story we were taught in school. Those are the dates studied and celebrated year after year, but what would the world be like if that surrender had never happened? Would we be here if the red and black flags of Nazi Germany had emerged victorious in the conflict? These questions have intrigued and fascinated historians for decades. In this new installment, we invite you to seek some answers about that grim alternate universe. Let's return to the past to explore the world where Adolf Hitler was crowned as the master of the old continent. April 1945. After months of siege, the German troops defending Berlin experience a miraculous recovery. Until a few months ago, all seemed lost, but now the Reich's infantry is gaining ground against the Red Army. It's only a matter of time before the Soviets are expelled from the capital, which will be remembered with shame in Moscow. After all, their bravest and most experienced men are losing the war against elderly, women and children who were recruited at the last minute by Germany. In the Führer's bunker, the news is received with joy. After several months of doubt and depression, the leader of all Germans appears vigorous. The thoughts of suicide that troubled his mind for a few weeks are far from his thoughts now. The dominion of Europe is within his gloved hand's reach, and he doesn't intend to let that irreplaceable opportunity slip away. But beyond the situation in Berlin, what's happening on the other fronts of the Second World War? In Northern Europe, the Allies' master strategy isn't yielding the expected effect. The landing in Normandy demanded great efforts in terms of human and material resources, but the progress in French territory has been too slow. After months, hundreds of thousands of Americans, French, and Canadians are dying of starvation due to the lack of supplies. Dealing a mortal blow, by the end of 1944, Germany managed to intercept and destroy the communication lines, trapping that huge human mass that carried out Operation Overlord. In Washington and London, there's nothing they can do about it. They can only hope for a miracle to rescue those men. Otherwise, hundreds of battalions of excellent soldiers will perish in an unsuccessful attempt to penetrate European territory. Without the help of the Allied powers, France is at the mercy of German troops, who take advantage of the failure in Normandy to capture cities at great speed. This not only provides them with a tactical advantage, but also allows them to replenish their supplies and even add new recruits to their ranks. Remember that for several years the French government of the Vichy Republic was one of Berlin's great collaborators. However, the Germans' ultimate goal is not to take photos again at the Eiffel Tower, but to take advantage of the proximity between French territory and the United Kingdom to carry out a land invasion. This plan, dubbed Operation Sea Lion, requires massive effort on Germany's part, but the booty at stake is too tempting. Just approaching the shores of England gives Hitler a winning hand when negotiating a hypothetical armistice. These defeatist news are not well received by the Western population. In all Allied capitals, society begins to demand a peaceful way out of the conflict. They don't want more death and are tired of the economic hardships that have been squeezing the stomachs and pockets of the working class since 1939. Social pressure and the massive death of soldiers on all fronts push the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, France, and China to give in to Germany's demands. The moment feared by the entire West finally materializes. Hitler has bent the arm of the entire planet and is now free to maintain the conquered territories and dominate his neighbors with an iron fist. What we have just narrated sounds like a nightmare, but that is one of the possible outcomes in this game of hypotheses. Once the war is over, it is time to heal wounds and evaluate the aftermath. The first outcome of the German victory is evident. It completely changes the distribution of political and military power on the planet. When the Axis collapsed in mid-1945, it not only meant the end of the Third Reich, but also marked the beginning of a new era. The empires and great powers of the 19th century were left behind. Now the new global players were the United States, Russia, and China. Although France and the United Kingdom appeared on that esteemed list of winners, the reality is that throughout the 20th century, their influence and military capacity would steadily decline compared to these three new powers. But if Hitler had emerged victorious, that geopolitical restructuring would never have occurred. Instead, the Germans would have risen as the great rulers of the world. Keep in mind that by 1938, just 1 year before the start of the Second World War, Germany had managed to recover from the previous conflict to position itself as one of the most powerful and prosperous countries. Its industry was growing rapidly, and its army was among the most modern of its generation. If we add to that power the vast amount of territory conquered during the war, as well as the technology developed in that period, the result is a country leading in all aspects. You surely know the stories of German scientists who, once the conflict ended, were recruited by major powers to work on nuclear and space programs. In the case of the United States, this project is known as Operation Paperclip, and it was a decisive policy in transforming Americans into a technological power in all areas. However, in the case of an Axis victory, all that knowledge and development would have remained German assets. It's not far-fetched to think of an eventual atomic bomb with an eagle painted on the side, much less in an advanced space program that could have put several satellites into orbit by the 1960s. As for submarines, the already powerful U-boats would surely have received countless modernizations. These details may seem trivial, but they are the kind of scientific achievements that, for example, made the Soviet Union the second planetary power. But the Germany that Hitler dreamed of was not just a utopia of science and development. It was also a hell on earth for anyone who did not fit into the twisted racial standards of Nazism. In this hypothesis, the most horrifying aspect is not the immediate victory and appropriation of territories, but the world's perspective on the Holocaust. In fact, it's likely that if the Allied troops had not liberated the hundreds of extermination camps, much of what we know about the massacres of the Third Reich would have remained the deepest of secrets. In a world where Hitler emerges victorious, eugenic policies would continue for years, and the only possible outcome is the slaughter of practically all Jews, Roma, and disabled individuals, as well as the exclusion of the rest of ethnic and religious minorities. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism was not exclusive to Nazi Germany. In other countries like France, Italy, and some regions of Eastern Europe, ethnic resentment ran deep. This can lead us to an unpleasant conclusion. In the event of a German victory, the methods of extermination would not have been condemned. In many cases, they would have been vindicated and adopted, as happened in Croatia and Romania. Let's take a moment to think about the feelings that the word Holocaust evokes in us. Today, it's impossible to separate that term from the horrors of the Second World War. In fact, German crimes are the paradigm by which we evaluate and punish all attacks against humanity. But that view largely depends on the side that emerged victorious, which had the privilege of recounting the events from its perspective. You know, the old saying that history is written by the victors. It's clear that if Germany had won the war, the Nuremberg trials or any other legal process against the torturers and murderers of the Reich would never have taken place. One possible side effect of this lack of justice could be seen in the numerous peace treaties, human rights agreements, and bilateral agreements signed after the war. In a world where no one was held accountable for the annihilation of millions of people, what would be the point of signing such documents? Next, we will hear a speech delivered by Winston Churchill to the U.S. Senate, where he warns that the union between nations is the only means to prevent such disasters.
Twice in a single generation, the catastrophe of World War has fallen upon us. Twice in our lifetime has the long arm of fate reached out across the oceans to bring the United States into the forefront of the battle. If we had kept together after the last war, if we had taken common measures for our safety, this renewal of the curse need never have fallen upon us.
The German supremacy in European culture would represent a radical change in the second half of the 20th century. First of all, it's likely that, over the years, the official language of the entire old continent would be German. Not only that, but even countries that were not under direct domination would have to adopt totalitarian and fascist policies to coexist harmoniously. This implies absolute repression of any artistic or social expression that goes against the conservative mandates of National Socialism. Literature and cinema would definitely be affected, and many intellectuals and artists would have emigrated to American countries, further polarizing the planet. In this game of suppositions, we start from the idea of an armistice ending the war. At this final point of the conflict, it's likely that the most affected European countries by the decision would be France and the United Kingdom. Geographical proximity, historical animosity, and economic interest led Germany to closely control these two nations. Whether through direct occupation and a totalitarian government, or as satellite territories allowed to develop a false democracy. Either way, this would provide Germans with a vast amount of resources, thus increasing their status as a global power. The question is, what would happen with the Russians? The case of the Soviet Union is particular because, although an armistice with Germany would have greatly damaged its political power, the truth is that the nation had the means to rebuild itself. It's unlikely that Germany could exert the same domination over the Soviets as it did with the French and British. Geography, hostile climate, territorial expanse, and the number of available soldiers make the conquest of the Soviet Union an almost impossible mission. The same goes for present-day Russia. Instead, the most likely scenario is one of a completely divided and constantly tense Europe. On one side, a gigantic Germany dominating militarily or politically the entire Western region. On the other side, Moscow with its satellite nations. It wouldn't have been long before a brutal war erupted, possibly on a nuclear scale between both fronts. In this fateful universe, the United States has a huge advantage. There is an ocean of distance between the old continent and its shores. Furthermore, its vast territorial expanse, geographical variety, and distribution of its cities make it, like the Soviet Union, almost impossible to invade and conquer. Nevertheless, Washington would have to negotiate constantly with Berlin to maintain peace. An actor we have overlooked for much of the video is Japan, the last country of the Axis still standing. The truth is that the German victory might not have any impact on the outcome of the war in the Pacific theater. Soviet forces were already gaining territory daily in Asia. Meanwhile, the United States was carrying out multiple offensives and preparing for the atomic bomb's deployment. The attack on Pearl Harbor had such an effect on American society that Washington would hardly have allowed including the Japanese island in the armistice. It's enough to refer to the words Franklin Delano Roosevelt uttered in 1940.
As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
In this case, the U.S. occupation in Japan would have had an even greater strategic value. Not only would it serve to keep the Soviet Union and China at bay, but also to keep a watchful eye on Nazi Europe. Before we continue, we want to remind you that this is just a game of hypotheses, and it's likely that many of our assumptions may not match yours. That's why we would like to know what your diagnosis is regarding this dark scenario. What do you think would have been the main effects of a Nazi victory in World War II? Leave us your answer in the comments box. Now, let's continue. The idea of a world dominated by the Axis powers generates a morbid fascination among both historians and fiction writers. That's why works such as The Man in the High Castle, written in 1962 by Philip K. Dick, or Fatherland, written in 1992 by Robert Harris, can be found where the possible societies resulting from that German victory are hypothesized. The strangest case is that of the book Swastika Night, written in 1937 by Catherine Burdekin, who even anticipated the start of World War II to imagine what the world would be like if Nazism spread throughout Europe. In all these works, German fascism is eaten away by its own contradictions and racial theories. Burdekin's novel is particularly brutal, as it is set several centuries in the future, in a world where Jews were exterminated, Christians are marginalized, and Hitler is revered as an ancient god. Fortunately, that nightmare scenario was relegated to the realm of fiction books. Throughout this video, we have reviewed an alternate universe trying to apply the ideas of Nazi Germany to the entire European territory. In an increasingly interconnected world, it's impossible for these policies not to have affected the rest of the countries, at least in a collateral way. Beyond the game of historical hypotheses, the truth is that these analyses serve to see how wars end up shaping the societies, culture, and industry of the countries involved. Being the Second World War the most important military conflict in recent history, it's understandable that a change in its outcome would have altered humanity in unimaginable ways. This brings us to the end of the video. If you like this type of content, we want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. This way, you can stay updated on all our news. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.